Little Miss Tiny by Roger Hargreaves. Little Miss Tiny was extremely small, not very tall at all. She was so tiny she didn't live in a house. Do you know where she lived? In a mouse hole, in the dining room of Home Farm. She'd made the mouse hole quite comfortable, really, and luckily there weren't any mice, because the farm cat, Ginger, had chased them all away. The trouble was, because she is so tiny, nobody knew she lived there. Nobody had noticed her, not even the farmer and his wife. So there she lived, all alone, with no one to talk to. She was very lonely and very sad. Oh dear. One day she was feeling so lonely she decided to be very brave and go for a walk. Out of her mouse hole she came. She crept across the dining room and went through the crack in the door and into the hall. To Little Miss Tiny the hall looked as big as a field, and she scuttled across it to the back door at the farm. Luckily for her, the letterbox was at the bottom of the door, so she squeezed herself through it and onto the doorstep. It was all very exciting. There before her was the farmyard. She went exploring. She came to a door with a gap at the bottom and ducked in underneath. There inside was a pig. A large pig. And if you're as small as Little Miss Tiny, a large pig looks very large indeed. Little Miss Tiny looked at the pig, and the pig looked at Little Miss Tiny. "Wah, wah," he grunted, and moved closer to inspect this little person who'd entered his sty.
Oh my goodness me!
Squealed Little Miss Tiny in alarm, and shot out of the pigsty as fast as her little legs would carry her, which isn't very fast because her legs are only very little. She ran right around the back of the pigsty before she'd stopped. She leaned against the wall and put her hands over her eyes and tried to catch her breath back. Suddenly she heard a noise. A very close noise. A sort of breathing noise. Very close indeed. Ooh! She hardly dared take her hands away from her eyes, but when she did she wished she hadn't. What do you think it was? Right there in front of her, looking at her with green eyes? Ginger, the farm cat. Poor Little Miss Tiny. Ginger grinned, showing his teeth.
Help!
Squealed Little Miss Tiny at the top of her voice.
Oh, somebody please help!
The trouble was, the top of Little Miss Tiny's voice is not a very loud place. Ginger grinned, another grin.
There's no escape.
Every day, Mr. Strong went to Home Farm to buy some eggs. He liked eggs, lots of them. That day he was walking home across the farmyard when he heard a very tiny squeak. He stopped. There it was again. Right around the corner. He looked round the corner and saw Ginger and the poor trapped Little Miss Tiny. "Shoo! Scat cat!" said Mr. Strong to Ginger, and picked up Little Miss Tiny, very gently. "Hello," he said. "Who are you?"
Are you Miss Tiny?
"Oh, you are, aren't you?" smiled Mr. Strong. "Well, if I was as tiny as you, I wouldn't go wandering around large farmyards,"
But
said Little Miss Tiny, and told Mr. Strong about how she was so lonely she had to come out to find somebody to talk to. "Oh dear," said Mr. Strong. "Well now, let's see if we can find you some friends to talk to,
thank you, Mr. Strong.
And now, every week, Mr. Strong collects Little Miss Tiny and takes her off to see her friends. 3 weeks ago, he took her to see Mr. Funny, who told her so many jokes she couldn't stop laughing all day. "Hey, Little Miss Tiny, why did the farmer call his pig Egg? Because he was always running out of the pen!" Two weeks ago, he took her to see Mr. Greedy. He told her his recipe for his favourite meal. Okay, so I have toast, 2 slices, cornflakes, 1 packet, milk, 1 bottle, sugar, 1 bowlful, toast, 3 slices, eggs, 3 boiled of course, toast, 4 slices, butter, 1 dish, marmalade, 1 pot, followed by 6 slices of toast. 6 slices of buttered toast.
But that's too much for a tiny little me.
She laughed. Mr. Greedy grinned. For you, he said, divide by 100. Last week, Mr. Strong took her to see Mr. Silly, and Mr. Silly told her how to stand on your head.
That's very silly.
Giggled little Miss Tiny. Thank you, don't mention it, replied Mr. Silly modestly. And guess who she met this week? Somebody who's become a special little friend. Ha! I never thought I'd meet anybody smaller than myself, laughed Mr. Small. Little Miss Tiny looked up at him and smiled.
You wait till I grow up, Bonichi.
She said.
I love to visit home farm and play around the house. Then today I noticed a hole made by a mouse. I always have been curious. I got down on my knees. I peered into the mouse hole and guess what I could see? Tiny table, tiny chair, tiny slippers on the stair. Who lives in this tiny home? Little Miss Tiny all alone. Tiny pictures on the wall. Everything is very small. Who lives in this tiny home? Little Miss Tiny all alone. She finds the barnyard frightening. She's terrified of pigs, and grinning cats are scary. Their teeth seem very big. But Mr. Strong is good to her. Each week they have a ball. They go to see the Mr. Men. Her favorite's Mr. Small. Tiny table, tiny chair, tiny slippers on the stair. Who lives in this tiny home? Little Miss Tiny all alone. Tiny pictures on the wall. Everything is very small. Who lives in this tiny home? Little Miss Tiny all alone. Tiny table, tiny chair.